Welcome, everyone. This is a take two. We're so excited to have you. This is Laura Putnam here, and I am with the fabulous and lovely and amazing MacKenzie, aka Kenzie Isaac, who is coming to us from, is it Indiana where you're?
Yep, Indianapolis.
Okay, so you're in Indianapolis, and I'm not sure if you're a Hoosiers fan or if basketball doesn't really figure into your life.
Yeah, my younger sister goes to IU Bloomington, so I've been brained into it slowly but surely.
Okay. I grew up in basketball country in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I was surrounded by a lot of people who are really into basketball. My claim to fame, which is by association, is that Michael Jordan fell in my twin sister's lap during a preseason scrimmage game, which is huge capital in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. But our conversation is going to be much more than basketball today. So Kenzie and I first met in San Diego just last month in April at the Art and Science of Health Promotion Conference. And I, like everyone else there, was so taken by you, Kenzie, and really impressed with the work that you're doing, and already such a leader. So tell us a little bit about, I know that you're now at Teachers College at Columbia, you're finishing up there, and then you're on your way to Oxford. You are a Rhodes Scholar, which congratulations. That is
Thank
so
you.
amazing. Yeah, really amazing to have. So in our interview today, we've got 5 questions. None of these have been scripted, although this is a take 2 because I messed up on the recording. So the first question has been asked already, but we're going to ask it again. So 3 words, Kenzie, that capture your story. And at the same time, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, so firstly, Laura, I have to thank you for this take 2 because now I'll be able to give a little bit more of a coherent answer to this question. But my 3 words are faith, sisterhood, and community. And not necessarily because I think that I've achieved the peak of each of those 3 words, but those are the 3 words, the 3 characteristics and roles that anchor me and keep me aspiring for all the things that I'm going after right now. So I hope to be a stronger person of faith. I grew up in a strongly Christian household, in African American Baptist tradition, and faith has completely shaped my lens, even as someone who's pursuing health education, public health. I'm getting my Master of Arts in Health Education at Teachers College right now. And something that's of particular interest to me is how faith and people's faith backgrounds contribute firstly to some of the stigma that they might encounter when it comes to navigating their own mental illness, but also how we can be in better dialogue with sacred texts about what it means to be whole and hopeful and well. So kind of the dual role of faith in that regard. So I went to the University of Notre Dame for my undergrad, and I chose the University of Notre Dame very ironically because I felt myself actively running away from it. But I wanted to understand what my personal walk in my faith and spiritual life looked like. And I felt that Notre Dame was the space most conducive to me really exploring myself. That's where I got especially interested and involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, which is also one of those sorts of anchoring charisms and ethics of my work. So overall, I had a very eye-opening and formative experience at Notre Dame, even having gone to Christian and Catholic schools my entire life. My second word is sisterhood, but really family, I think would capture even better who I am. So I'm a sister in multiple capacities. I'm a big sister biologically. I'm a big sister to a lot of my younger cousins, but I'm also a member of a sorority called Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, one of the first Black Greek sorority for college educated women. And through that sorority, I've learned what it really means to accompany people on their journeys, and not just accompany other people, but allow myself to be accompanied. As someone whose personality type isn't necessarily inclined to radical vulnerability or vulnerability at all, being a sister in all these different ways has pushed me to grow in ways that I never thought possible. It's allowed me to experience a full range and spectrum of emotions, and it's ultimately given me a level of compassion that is necessary for a health educator, and I think actually will make me a much more effective health educator. And related to sisterhood and all of my familiar roles are community. So whenever someone says, "Oh, Kenzie Isaac's a Rhodes Scholar," my heart leaps a little bit because I'm like, they can't be talking about me. I was awarded this scholarship in November,
Mm.
and I'm still kind of jolting from the realization of what this means, not only for my life, but for the life of the community that I hope to invest in as much as they've invested in me. And in the spirit of transparency, Laura, imposter syndrome, it can consume me some days. And the one thing that helps me climb out of those moments of imposter syndrome is recognizing that this isn't just my accomplishment. I stand on the shoulders of so many people in my community, so many of my neighbors who carry with them so much wisdom, so many peers, so many mentors, where if they applied for this Rhodes Scholarship, they'd run circles around me in terms of competition. And so, in honoring that acknowledgement of the scholarship, it's also honoring them and all that they have poured into me, into this recognition, because it really does belong to all of us. And I do think that that collective community mindset is the only reason I've been able to go to Notre Dame, Columbia, now Oxford. So that's a little bit about me and my life perspective in a nutshell.
And by the way, I just want to share with our listeners, this was not pre-scripted. And you are amazing, Kenzie, that you were able to so eloquently respond to that. But I love this idea of community responsibility, collective community working together, and the combination of the faith, sisterhood, and community, and this idea that your accomplishments are in fact our accomplishments, and that they rest on the shoulders of so many others. And I think that's certainly something that we've all learned from the pandemic, have we not? Which is this idea of just how much my health and well-being matters to you, and how much yours matters to me, and that there simply is no me without you, and the only way forward is together, and that my successes are your successes, yours are mine, and that together we can make the world a better place.
Yes, that was so beautifully said. And something that I've learned as an aspiring social epidemiologist as well is that looking at the individual will never give you the full story. Because not only do we exist in community and relationship with one another just as humans, but we exist in these really complicated systems, and we're implicated in all of these complicated systems. And that has a bearing on our bodies, our minds, and our spirits. So just saying this particular health behavior is your fault and here's how you can fix it is not going to get to the sorts of health equity outcomes that we really want to see. And as health educators that are usually like patient facing and people facing, it can be easy to see the person in front of us as like a case in a vacuum, like this is what you need to do. But thinking deeper, I mean, the great thing about being a part of Teachers College is that, you know, when you're talking to one person, they help you realize when you're talking to one person, you're talking to all the people behind them, their
It's so
community,
true.
you're talking to their household. So everything that you said is so spot on.
And you know, the world of medicine, as we know in the United States, is so different from the world of public health. And the world of medicine is really about the individual, the choices that the individual makes, whereas public health is much more looking at the ecosystems within which the individual operates. And kind of in the whole world, kind of a parallel world of personal growth, even the world of wellness, it's been so much around this narrative of personal responsibility. And in the process of that, we've really overlooked the role of collective responsibility, and just how much we really arguably are more creatures of culture than we are creatures of habit. And so if we really want to improve the health and well-being for all of us, we need to think more collectively around changing the ecosystem within which these individuals are operating and making their choices.
Hmm. Wow.
Okay, are you ready for question number 2?
Ready.
Okay. All right. So I had an exchange on LinkedIn, and this is really what inspired this call.
Mm.
And this is a young man who is nice enough to follow some of my work on LinkedIn. And in this exchange, I wrote, "Together we can change the world." And here's what he wrote in response. He said, quote, "I'm completely lost. I'm only," at my response to him. He says, "I'm only 18 and I haven't really been anywhere. I'm just a college student from a small town in your state, Indiana." So my question to you is, what advice would you give to him?
The first thing that I want to reassure this 18-year-old, because it almost makes me emotional, because just 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when I was 18, I was thinking of in a very similar manner. We're all lost and we're all wandering. But that's what makes us human. And that's what should wake us up every morning and inspire us to pursue knowledge, pursue love, pursue passion, knowing that everyone else is just wandering as well. And the goal in life is to find other people along your own wandering and come alongside them. And as I said before, allow them to come alongside you in relationship. That's kind of my life philosophy. And then to the point about I've not been anywhere, you have been somewhere. You've been in your own life.
Mhm.
And I think that especially in academic spaces, lived and living experiences aren't upheld as valuable nearly enough.
Mhm.
What you've gone through in your life, even if you feel like your life has consisted of just super mundane things, that knowledge is needed in academic spaces across the world to give us a better understanding of what it means to treat one another with compassion. And whatever you're going through, it's a question of human rights. You can share that knowledge with other people and it can inform like our whole lens about what it means to pursue human rights, because your story is just that important. So that was just a very long-winded way for me to say that where you are right now, where you've been, is just as important as where you hope to go, and just as important as where I'm sure you're going to go along your road to success. So let that that sense of the importance of who you are, who your community is, your story, your community story, drive you to unapologetically enter into spaces and say, this is my life, this is my experience. It should be considered in knowledge production processes. And let's see what good can come out of it, whether it be changes of actual policies or a change of a campus or a community culture, even changes in conversations that you might have at the dinner table with your families. Matter.
And it's so interesting, I think, Kenzie, you spoke at the beginning about feeling imposter syndrome, in which
Yeah,
in many ways I feel like is part of this question that he asked me.
yeah.
And so on the one hand, you're saying that each of us can lean into where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And on the other hand, we all experience imposter syndrome. Speak to that.
Yes. Imposter syndrome is so unbelievably loud for how wrong it is pretty much all the time. And something that I've learned, honestly, just coming of age in the era that we're in, is that the loudest voices aren't always the ones telling the truth. Very rarely are they actually the pure truth tellers in this world. And imposter syndrome is the same way, loud and wrong. And so I just want to reassure the student and anyone who's watching this right now that imposter syndrome is really, it's real. And I'm not here to invalidate those feelings or say don't feel imposter syndrome, because it can invade so many spaces that we're in. But just knowing that the knowledge that you have inside of you from just being an expert on your own lived experience is something that you will always know best, and no one can take away that expertise from
And
you.
at the same time that you bring value to others as well.
Exactly. And actually, to that point, if I may offer just like a concrete word of encouragement and advice, find mentors, whether they be peer mentors, whether they be mentors who are at a point in their career that you just ultimately aspire to, who are going to see assets in you that you may not even see in yourself and draw that out. People whose presence and voices are loud enough to tell imposter syndrome, like, all right, shut up, like that's enough. You know, and these aren't necessarily people who are loud in the literal sense, like they'll yell at you like, you're so great. I mean, we all need those cheerleaders as well. But people who you can trust to talk through those self-doubts, and who can be a neutral party outside of yourself to remind you that you are fabulous. Your lived experiences are valuable because they're seeing them in real time outside of your own body, and to take them and roll with them, and don't apologize for all of the highly ambitious things you might want to do with that experience.
Yes, exactly. So that brings us, very nice segue to question number 3.
Awesome.
Quote, a quote that we've heard many, many times, and this was pre-conversations about imposter syndrome, but I think it really speaks to imposter syndrome. So the quote that actually came from Marianne Williamson, but was made famous in the 1994 inauguration of Nelson Mandela in post-apartheid South Africa, quote, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? Yeah, we have some voices in the background here. So let's hear what are your thoughts on that?
This is such a dense quote that I actually revisit all the time, multiple times a year. And especially contending with what the Rhodes Scholarship means for my community. Who am I not to be is it's a critical question. Cecil Rhodes, when he first laid out in his will who he wanted to be a Rhodes Scholar, he did not imagine someone who looked like me or who comes where I come from. And so on top of all of that imposter syndrome and internalized self-doubt, there are external narratives like, who do I think I am? You know, to receive the scholarship, take it, make attempts to basically overturn this enormously horrendous imperialistic legacy through drawing money from that same bucket of wealth. And I think that the reason that I keep asking myself these questions and doubting myself, I think it is a protective mechanism against the fear of just how powerful, not just I, but like all of my fellow scholars, people in my generation, everyone in the public health education field can be if we collaborate and we just say the status quo is unacceptable because it was built on the backs of people who look like me, built on the backs of the ancestors, and not made in the image of just of us, of all of us. And because change is scary, even if that change has the potential to be positive, we keep asking that question, who do we think we are? Because it keeps us from having to spark that change, because the person who's the first always faces the most persecution, is always typically the least remembered in history. Their movement is the least glamorized. It's the most stagnant. But someone has to be the first. And so going back to that quote, why can't it be me? Why can't it be us? Because the person who's the first always does it for the person who's the second and the third. and the fourth. And if I really am driven by this ethic of community, as I say, then these are the sorts of things that I always have to keep at front of mind, no matter how scary it might seem or feel. I'm sure that my ancestors, throughout different points in not just American history, but even before that, were incredibly fearful. But were it not for them pushing beyond that fear, I wouldn't even be in existence, let alone talking about a Rhodes Scholarship. Are you kidding me? So these are all the things that I have to contend with on a day to day, and that's why I appreciate this quote, because it puts it much more concisely than I ever can what I'm constantly thinking about.
So again, being who am I, which is actually the title of our interview today.
Right.
Who am I not to be? Who am I not to be the one to start that movement or make the world a better place? So bringing us to question number 4. Why We Can't Sleep is the title of a book by Ada Calhoun. And she is a Gen Xer, which is what I am. And she found herself in the throes of a midlife crisis. And she thought that she had no right to complain. She was married with children, had a good career. So why did she feel so miserable? And why did it seem that other Gen X women were also feeling miserable? And as she dug into this, she uncovered things like housing costs, HR trends, credit card debt averages, divorce data. And she realized that this was something that was happening across, for these Gen X women. She was not alone in this. And these problems were largely being overlooked. So what's keeping your generation up at night? If your title for your generation would be Why We Can't Sleep, what are the driving forces behind? So first of all, tell us about your generation, and then what's keeping them up at night? Why can't they sleep?
I want to begin by saying that her name's, you said, Ada Calhoun. Yeah, what she said struck a chord, because I think that she captures what I think pretty much on a day to day, and it's that if you have your eyes and your ears and your hearts towards the world around you, then of course you're not able to sleep right now. There's so much existential dread that's surrounding us, and we're all, just as we're all lost and wandering, we're all trying to find a place where we can situate ourselves and make a meaningful impact and make our lives matter amidst all the dread. And so in that regard, I don't think that Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zs, of which I'm an elder member, are that distinct from one another. And there's so many ways I can answer your question about what keeps Gen Z, especially kind of millennial Gen Z cuspers like myself, up at night. We could talk about climate change. We could talk about this economic inflection point. If I can even use the singular point because of just all the fluctuations. Honestly, race relations coming to a head, and thinking about standing in horrifically racist legacies, and thinking about how we might be complicit in racist systems ourselves. And I think that all of those different facets of our existential dread can be boiled down to like our kids who don't yet exist. What personally keeps me up at night is thinking about like a child that hasn't even been thought of, but would I be willing to bring a child or children into the world as we know now, not knowing if our climate will be stable enough for me to even, see mid-career, let alone my child see their birth. With so much vitriol happening on the political stage, so many topics that should be questions of human decency and not, turned into partisan debates up for debate. How do we raise younger people up to be able to assert their worth and understand that what's written into law does not equate what justice truly is? And as a Christian, what God intended for this world to be and function like. So I think those are the big things that keep me up at night, as well as thinking about what can I do to make my life the most meaningful amidst it all. How do I find my locus of control and then grasp onto it and have enough focus to actually work within that locus of control to make a difference? Because I think that I'm very similar to a lot of my peers in the sense that I'm very scatterbrained, because one day I'll wake up and I want to be, working in the climate justice scene. And then, other days I might wake up and I want to work in the reproductive justice scene. And then other days I'll wake up and I'm like, I need to organize a protest to really combat the militarization of law enforcement and police forces. Not really taking enough time to sit down to realize all of these issues are intertwined, and we just have to be aware of what we're raising up our kids in.
I love that idea that there's this anxiety around kids who don't even exist, these kids in the future, and this existential anxiety around, do I even bring them in? So one of the things that you spoke about in your response, and this brings us to our last question, which is this idea of locus of control. And I think I often think about Viktor Frankl. I've heard others pronounce his last name as Frankl. The author of Man's Search for Meaning. We can overlook the fact that he wrote it as man's search. I mean, that leaves out 50% of people right there. That's always bugged me, right? As opposed to human search for meaning.
That's
but
right.
he talks about this idea, as you know, of that while we may have little or no control over the circumstances in our lives, things like climate change, that's the stimulus, if you will. We have infinite power as to how we respond to those circumstances. That's our response. And in the space between stimulus and response lies our inner freedom. Kenzie, what is your inner freedom?
Wow. And it's funny because I was actually going to say that in that space between stimulus and responses is hope. And I would say that my inner freedom is synonymous with this idea of hope. I don't know how I would raise a child 10, 15, 20 years from now, but I have hope that in that huge amount of time, people are able to band together and envision a future that when people look at history textbooks about us, we would actually want to take claim over. I have hope that, and I think that this is also kind of my faith-based side coming out as well. I have hope that a lot of the vitriol that we see in this world is rooted in fear that can be addressed and overcome with just compassionate dialogue and empathy, and giving people space to tell their story when a lot of the lashing out comes from having to be silent for way too long. I have hope that the people who come in charge of our policy systems and environments begin to look more like me, begin to be more women, begin to, identify across every spectrum of every sort of intersectional identity that you might have. Hope is what I truly believe is what's gotten humanity this far to this point. And as a health educator, you have to be driven by hope, especially in a field that is so, like many other fields, so deficit oriented. What are people doing wrong, and what can you do to change them? By seeing people's inherent potential and having hope that they can tap into that inherent potential, and having hope that you're qualified enough to come alongside them and doing that, that's how wellness happens. That's how healing happens. And I think the same way that can happen for an individual person who moves out of, pre-diabetes, or who decides to get, a screening and gets an early detection for a disease that can now be stifled. It can happen for the entire body that is our society. And something that I actually wrote in my Rhodes personal statement was this idea that we're all works in progress. And being a works in progress means that there's always going to be room for grace, grace that you can afford yourself and grace that you can afford the people around you. And it's through that grace and not perfection, because perfection doesn't leave room for us to afford grace, that we're all able to grow, that we're able to innovate, that we're able to heal in body, mind, and spirit. So I would say kind of that space between stimulus and response is that crossroads where hope and grace meet in every possible way. And I probably should have prefaced all this by saying I am an optimist. I am an idealist, but I also think that optimism and idealism of the most absurd kinds are how we've gotten this far as just a human race to begin with.
But at the beginning, Kenzie, I asked you the 3 words that capture your story, and you shared faith, sisterhood, and community. And to wrap us up, you have shared the 3 words of hope, grace, and optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anyone who embodies those 3 words, it is you. You radiate hope, grace, and optimism. And I know that I personally am so much better off for knowing you and having you in my life. And I know that the same is true for everyone who is lucky enough to get to come in contact with you, whether it's in person or virtually. So I'm so glad to feel so lucky to be able to share you with so many others. So thank you so much.
My gosh, that means the world to me. This conversation means the world to me. And oh my gosh, I wish I could just reach through the screen and give you a hug. Thank you for all of who you are and just love and energy and wisdom that you radiate.
Thank you so much, Kenzie.